that name and address gets on the on the NCOA database, which is maintained in Memphis, Tennessee, at the National Customer Support Center.
Marvin, can I barge in right with a quick question for you that applies to what you're going through right now?
Yep.
And this is from Karen. Not sure if you're going to talk about this, but can you talk about the typical levels that records get matched against these hygiene programs, individual, household, etc.?
Yes, I definitely, I can definitely do that. I really, when there's later on in our presentation, we're going to be talking about reports and matching and that type of thing, and I will definitely cover that at that point in time. Back to the NCOA. The NCOA, if it's an individual move, it has to match, it matches at an individual level. If it's a family move, then it matches at a last name and address level. The matching criteria with the Postal Service is extremely strict, so doesn't have to be an exact, but pretty close to an exact match for them to provide you with a new address. It can flag the record though as a potential NCOA, where the match isn't exact enough to provide you with a new address, but it could flag it and give you various footnote codes on why it believes that it's a potential match. People that fill out a change of address that do not have a forwarding address to provide or do not want to provide it, but they still get on the NCOA database. These are what I would consider to be true NCOAs and ones that we recommend that you drop in your mailing. If you're utilizing that information to update your database, I would say to flag it, but do not remove it from your database, because at some point in time, they may complete the change of address through NCOA, or you may, through another product that I'll talk about here in a second, PCOA, get that actual, where it was a NCOA with the Postal Service, find the forwarding address in another process. And these are people that moved with no forwarding address, moved out of the country, their box was closed, things of that nature. PCOA, which proprietary change of address. This is a database that is compiled by multiple sources. There's many companies out there that provide this service. We utilize a company to do this. We don't maintain this in-house, and it's compiled through thousands of different sources and validated through multiple sources before a name and address and a transaction for that name and address will end up getting on the file. I will say, and it's just like anything else, is it 100%? No. Could it change an address for someone and incorrectly? Yes, it could do that. But you know, I always kind of use the 95% rule. If it changed 95% or 99% of them correct, and there was that 1% that didn't get changed correctly for your mailings, I think it's definitely worthwhile from that perspective. But it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. I've done tests for clients that we've done mailings and we changed the records for some and not for others and tracked them, and it just didn't work well enough to cover the cost. I've done it for others where it's made a tremendous amount of difference in their mailing and in their response. So again, it's something to test, to look at, to talk about, to see if it would work for you or for your clients and their mailings. But it's a very valuable product that's out there. And it can provide a good service, but again, it's not for everybody.
And if I can raise something just real quick, is the fact that the way PCOA came about is the fact that NCOA, still there's about 30% of the people who move who do not file with the USPS their new change information. So there is that gap that is built within the NCOA product. And I can't tell you how many times people have come back to us saying, well, I ran NCOA, how come I didn't get all all these addresses returned? They can't be delivered and everything else. Well, it's that gap that's in there of people who actually did not file. So that's how PCOA came about. It was trying to fill that 30% gap within the NCOA product by using proprietary sources and gathering their change of address information and compiling them onto one file. So it's a complement to NCOA. And to Marvin's point, some people use it very successfully. Others, you got to test it every year and see what works.
Yeah. And I just saw a couple of questions and comments that popped up. Yes, PCOA actually has more than 48 months worth of data. I think it's somewhere between 5 to 6 years worth of data. And again, that can change based on who you're utilizing as a provider and maintaining that database. Also, in terms of utilizing PCOA to update your database, here's what I would say. My personal feeling is you know your donors or your customers better than anybody else. And so if you have active donors that you are in constant communication with, I do not recommend that you take PCOA changes for like 0 to 12, 0 to 18 months and apply those to your database and necessarily change it. You're in communication with them. They tell you, you hope that when they're making changes and providing you with that information. But if it's someone that you haven't had communication with for a while, and maybe for the ones that are 0 to 18, maybe you put a flag in there that said, I got a PCOA change, but I'm going to keep the existing address that I have right now, just because that's the way that they, made their last donation 4 months ago. But for older records and all that you haven't had any communication with, I would strongly recommend that you utilize the information for PCOA to update your database with, but not for active donors. You know them better than any other third party might know them and how they like to communicate with you. Deceased processing, databases that are developed and by multiple organizations. It's compiled from multiple sources, but the main source for the deceased databases is the Social Security Administration records. And that, consists of, the majority of but you still have other sources that feed into it. I know that a lot of the PCOA providers have those types of flags within their databases as well, along with deceased databases that, complement that too. So, what I will say is, again, test it. If you're not doing it, test it, see if it makes sense not to do it. That's a lot of mail going out if you're mailing to deceased. There's also ways creatively that you might flag the deceased that is done at an individual level when doing the matching. But what you may want to do is, maybe still mail them to the family. There's always a possibility of doing that. There is a process out there called Family Connect that you can take your own names, your own house names, and you could, records that you have that you've identified as deceased, run the deceased processing on some of your house names. You can provide those names and addresses to an organization that can provide you with a different person in the household that you could potentially mail to, and it would be just like mailing a rented record. You send them the names and addresses of the deceased, they provide you with a different name and household, and you could use it as a rental record in. Again, might not be for everybody, but it's something to look at and potentially consider doing. I will say, dead people do respond. I mean, there's many stories that are out there about where, somebody was mailed to, and there's one that goes back in my mind back a few years ago where there was a mailing piece that was mailed to an individual that had passed away. And if I remember correctly, it was her brother that was looking through all of her paperwork and through the will and this, that, and the other, and found different mailing pieces from this organization, and had started doing some research and found out that his sister was one that, this was an organization that meant a lot to her. And during his research, and so, what he did is he donated $1 million to that organization. Now, will every deceased person that you mail to that happen? Absolutely not. But it's just an example of something that could potentially happen. So I'm not saying that you should be mailing your deceased, And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be, but what I'm saying is you should be, looking at that as an additional product that, does provide value, but does it provide value to you? And it's something like anything else you should test. And just because it made sense, like I said earlier, 3 years ago, does it continue to make sense? I know one organization that about twice a year, they will take their deceased names and do different things creatively and mail them. And they're getting some results based on that evidently are making sense to them to continue to do it. But in the acquisition programs for names that you're renting and things of that nature, can I say that I would say, and one of these things that I've noticed, over the years, especially when NCOA became, the 95-day window, most rented files that you're getting, people are doing a really good job of NCOAing the files and keeping them up to date on their rented names. But are they doing deceased? Are they doing PCOA, things of that nature? Probably not. No sense in, incurring that kind of cost associated with applying that to all the databases. But in utilizing it, in your acquisition mailings, it could very well make sense for you. Prison suppressions, that is definitely, there's a file, the DMA actually puts it out, 2 or 3 times a year, an updated file of different correctional facilities, and there's no names associated with it. It's strictly addressed and used as a suppression file in the merge purge process.
Marvin, we do have another question about deceased.
Yes.
Deceased processing doesn't have any process, every person that's deceased, does it? Also, can you talk a little bit how you think COVID might be affecting this process, if at all?
Yeah, definitely not everybody that is deceased ends up on whomever's deceased database. Basically, the matches that you get, that's, it's a win-win, but will it find everybody? Will everybody be on there? Will the way the name is spelled, and when you're doing this at an individual level and you're matching to it, and and the matching criteria that determines a match, there's a lot of variations. And, I know, like when some of the stuff that we do, you can look at an exact match and say, okay, I want to go for the exact match. Or you can have exact name match, but slightly different in the address, and vice versa. Those types of things, you can look at those in terms of making a determination. Also looking at, has this been confirmed? Is it confirmed through a death certificate by a relative, or is it the name and address appears on the file, but there's no confirmation for one of those two things? So those are other things that you can look at to make a decision on whether you're going to drop those or not. Has COVID made an impact on this? I would definitely say it probably has, to the extent of, potentially more people getting on the file and potentially more frequent updates to the databases. I know we get a monthly database update with our internal deceased processing that we do, and I believe that's fairly common, through the industry. Did I answer?
And I think there was another point about, actually the application of the flag to the database, and I think you've kind of covered that. Yeah, it should be flagged, but don't delete it.
Right.
And exactly. What about a spouse that continues to donate to the deceased? I think you want to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I can use a real life story on mine. I mean, when my father passed away, and this was back in 1993, my mother still wanted to receive mail in my father's name. She just liked that. And the causes that they were both passionate about, she continued to be passionate about and make donations, but in many cases made donations in my father's name. So, that is, another example of where the piece for my father, I know went into the household, and my mother was not bothered by that, but I also know that others, I see, mail being returned and nasty little notes assigned to it that people might send in where they don't like that. So, it can go a lot of different ways.
Well, and I think ultimately the end result is the donor is going to tell you how they want to be contacted.
Right. Exactly. The DMA do not mail preference file, the DMA pander file. This is a file that consists of people that have gone online and contacted the DMA and indicated they do not want to receive solicited mail. And what I will say, in the merge process, you can do that process at an individual level. You can do that process at a household level. I have clients that do it, different ways. It just depends on what your preference is. If you feel like this, someone in the household has gotten on this file, so you don't want to send a piece to it, even if it's addressed to a different person, then I recommend you do it at a household level. If you only want to mail it to that, if you only want to drop that individual that was on the Panda file, but potentially mail to another individual in the household, then do it at an individual level. It's just a business decision that you need to make. There is no really right or wrong answer as it relates to that. Okay, I've got the chat line up too, just to seeing if there was something else in regards to that.
Nope, we're clean.
Okay, profanity suppression. The profanity file is a file that consists of a lot of bad words and phrases and things of that nature that potentially could be on your file. And this is a way to match to that database and eliminate records from that. And I can tell you how this transpired with us at MMI Direct. We started doing work years ago with the Disney Movie Club. And there was a piece of, and I think it was the first or second mailing that we did for them. There was a piece of mail that went out, and it went to the CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner. And not only did it say Michael Eisner, Disney, it also had on that address line, "You greedy bastard." And so, needless to say, Michael Eisner was not very happy with that. And so, I think John got a phone call, then I got a phone call. And so I think what we did at that particular time, that Friday afternoon of that same week, we got everybody together from the office, went down to our local bar in Maryland called Langways, and we sat around and we tried to come up with as many bad words as we possibly could come up with, start the creation of the MMI Direct profanity database. It has built over time. And it is, it's a way to look at, let's say, if you're only mailing the records that get a zip +4 and a delivery point barcode appended to it, there is no need for you to look at the street address or the city name to determine whether that record might have a phrase or word in it that could be considered, profane, or a buzzword that you're just looking for, that you've decided, oh, I don't want anybody, if it says null anywhere in a name or address field, I'm just going to drop that record. I just don't trust that record. So, but if it's got a +4 appended to it, no reason to look at that. So where do you look? You look in the name, you look in the company field, you might look at the extra line of address field if that field is populated with some erroneous data. And that's what you would look at. If you are mailing records that don't have a zip +4 appended to them, which means whatever was in there is in there and it's going to necessarily get mailed, then you might consider, you would probably want to look at the street address and go through the table and determine whether you want to retain or drop that record. What I will tell you, it is a bit of an overkill. There is a little bit of an overkill in the process. So you weigh the fact of, I'd rather not have something like that go out that has that phrase or word in it, and maybe not mail 10 pieces that I could have mailed, that type of thing. So it's something to consider. Talk to us about it, your data provider about it if you're not using it, and see where that might fit into your process.
And Marvin, isn't it more of an issue with more house files than rented files?
Yeah, I was just getting ready to say that. So,
whoops.
In the example that I gave you on the Disney Movie Club, that was a house record. That was a record that was on their house file. So obviously there was an employee within Disney that did not like Mr. Eisner and put that actually in there. And it goes back to how data is gathered. Any information, depending on what your standards are that you have set up, anybody could type anything in there and it could potentially get through depending on what your rules are and what you're going to accept and where information can be. There were not that too many years ago, there were stories on 60 Minutes about exactly that type of thing. I won't go into what those were, but what the most famous words are the words you never want to hear. Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes is here. You just don't want those types of things happening. So anyway, enough on profanity or buzzwords. Let's see.
Marvin, I have an important question here from Karen. Can we add to the profanity file for that, meaning this group?
Oh, absolutely. Send us all the bad words that you know. Send them to John. and yes, and to that same question as well, you can, if there's other words that you might think that you might not be part of it, provide them to us and they can be added to because most of the profanity files are tailored to the client. It's not necessarily one universal file because names can be added, removed, things of that. Donor file dedupe, I find this to be something that in most internal databases continues to be an ongoing problem where duplicate records get into your database. So you have basically it's the same name, it's the same address, variations, or one of them was a move address and one of them's an owed address, and their donations or purchases are not tying together. I strongly recommend that, at least once a year, you're looking at that and you're running a process that looks to determine if you have duplicates within your database so that you can tie those donor IDs together into one and all that transactional data to just the one record versus having the same record 2 or 3 or 4 times. And I've seen that over the years when we've done cleanups where that type of thing happens. And a lot of the time it relates to moves with NCOA where there's a change and you've got the old on there, but the new address doesn't seem to follow it and that type of thing. And it's definitely something that you want to be doing, period.
Marvin, a good question came up, and that's from Nova. Where would government addresses fall in everything you just described?
Government addresses in terms of like a business or a government facility?
Yeah, like the White House, right, Pentagon.
Right. Well, unless the White House moved down the street, they won't appear on the NCOA database. But I can say that an individual within a company, no matter what the company, if they change jobs, you can fill out a change of address, a business address for a particular individual, and apply that at an individual level. Or when companies move, they also provide a change of address. PCOA, to my knowledge, is strictly residential names and addresses.
Right.
NCOA database does maintain company addresses. And to some government facilities, which are considered where they have their own zip code, they are considered unique zip codes, where that zip code is tied strictly to that government facility, such as the Pentagon. It has its own zip code. So, and those types of flags are assigned through these various hygiene processes that will identify that address as a unique zip which tied to something of that nature. All right. So, any other questions relating to that part?
Nope, I think we're clean.
Okay, cool. So, what are the red flags? What should you be looking at and talking to your data provider about based on the information that is provided through all these hygiene processes? And we're gonna, I want to talk about that. I'll share some stories with you as it relates to things that we have seen and dealt with, over the course of, our history with this type of process. So this is a list hygiene report, and the list hygiene report here that we produce is strictly statistical information. So this is showing you how it matches to the CAS DPV database that appends a zip +4 and does zip code correction, the NCOA database, which provides, people that match that have been moves with a new address and moves with no forwarding address, and the PCOA address where you have, a new address applied by PCOA. What I will tell you is, in those processes, as John mentioned earlier, PCOA is a complement to NCOA. So you run NCOA first. And NCOA changes are not going to get overwritten by PCOA changes. So if it changed it for NCOA, but one thing I have noticed with PCOA is that many of those moves without new address get converted over to a new address in the PCOA process. So what are you looking at here within the reports that might jump out at you, or what you should be looking at and talking to your service provider about that could be a potential problem? And what those things are, and probably if you'll go on to the next slide, we'll kind of jump to some examples might be easier to see, to analyze is, zip +4 percentage. On rented lists today, I see anywhere from like 98 to 100% hit rate on zip +4. They are usually extremely clean. Where I will see degradation in zip +4 hits are within suppression and house data, because they're not necessarily maintained as frequently and other data can get in there. I was looking at a report today where a file, and I think a lot of it had been, it's on the suppression file, and potentially they don't have full name and address information for this individual, but they have some information. It's a name, and maybe they decide that in some of these types of suppression, somebody called in and they were just irate of receiving a piece, but they didn't get the address, but they got the name, so the name went on the database. Or they got the name and they found, they know where they, the city that they lived in, and that's all that they put in. Or this information was gathered online, and you might see 80% hit rate, 50% hit rate. And those types of flags are the things that you're looking at to determine, do I potentially have a problem? Is there a problem with the address? Why am I having all of these records that are not matching to the USPS database based on the address? And a lot of that is just, it's missing information. But it also could be that your service provider, us, MMI Direct, screwed something up when we converted the file. We may have, instead of picking up the address correctly, maybe we truncated the first position of the street name. And so the first numeric of the street address was dropped off. And so now that list, it gets, it's not matching because the numbers are not matching up to what's on the DPV database. So we got a low hit rate. So those types of flags, not only for you to look at as it relates to potential house data to get cleaned up, or am I renting lists, and why am I getting these low hit rates on lists that I'm renting from a deliverability standpoint? It's for us to look at to make sure, hey, let's go back and check to make sure we did everything right as it relates to converting the file from the format provided into the format that we're going to run it in. Or potentially, could the file that was sent to us had that information truncated, and that being low, a low hit rate. And on rented files, when we see something low like that, that causes us to even go back even further to the provider just to see, and maybe we will even go online and pick out some of the addresses and just type them into the USPS database website to see what it reflects there as well. And so those are the types of things. If we got a huge amount of zip code corrects, that would be another thing to say, well, we must not have picked up the zip code correctly, or it might not have been provided correctly. And so we corrected, a large percentage. And so, we're looking at 98+% on the majority of the files. We're looking at, none or, less than, 0.2% on zip code corrects, those types of things. As far as NCOA hit rates, what I normally see today, and it's completely different than it was 5 years ago, those hit rates are usually lower. You know, they're usually falling somewhere in the 1 to 2%, because from the list side, people are maintaining and running NCOA and doing that at least probably quarterly. And in many cases, they're doing it more frequently. I've got a couple of lists that come in that, you know, at first when they started coming in, you know, we were getting like one hit or no hits. And I was like, well, something's got to be wrong. But then I look at the data and the reporting that was provided, and I see they ran NCOA 2 days ago on the file that they just sent to us. So that would make sense. But I can also tell you a horror story of a file that came in that we got 0 hits on. And we were looking at it and, you know, looking at the data, and everything looked right. There were the names and the addresses, nothing matched up. We had like a 99% hit rate on Zip+4, but we got no NCOA hit rates. And we also got no PCOA hit rates. So it just, you know, doesn't make any sense why that would be. And so we go back and we start looking, we contact the people providing the file to us and say, anything odd happened as it relates to that? And the initial response was no, we don't, everything looked okay. So started investigating more, and the file actually came to us as an Excel spreadsheet. And so as we went back and investigated and talked internally to make sure, one, we didn't open up that spreadsheet and decide to sort it somehow to look at it in one way. So we went back to the provider, and it turns out that what they had done is they had highlighted certain columns in the spreadsheet before they sent us the file and did a sort, which basically mismatched the address with the name. So the name on the file didn't match to the address. So that happened. Now, if we hadn't noticed it, that we got 0 hits, and not to say we're infallible, because sometimes, you know, something like that could potentially get biased. That could have gone out in the mail and there would have been 0 responses. But in this particular case that I was looking at, we did notice it. I think we even had a case a number of years ago. We might not have noticed it. And you know, you have to, you know, look at that, and you develop procedures. If something like that comes up, those types of things have to be investigated all the way back to the source, and then present to the client, say, I'm not sure if I trust this or not. You may want to drop this file and not mail it. And then it becomes a business decision there.
Marvin, just to let you know, we have 10 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So those are the things on the list hygiene. Again, the statistical report. We'll go to the next slide, which is the list processing report. And these are various things that are determined through all the various hygiene processes that I talked to you about early on. Do you want to drop these records or not? Should you keep them? How many, you know, what kind of percentages are you used to in having deceased records, NCOA undeliverables, pander matches, profanity, cast rejects, rejects because of no name, vacant lots? All of those categories are different types of flags that are assigned to a name or address, where you need to make the business decision on whether I should be mailing these or not. And then in some of the cases, the record count's so low that it would really be hard to test whether you're going to mail them or whether you're not going to mail them. But in other cases, it's not. You know, deceased is usually a fairly decent percentage of records overall, in terms of, you know, what you should, you know, whether you to have enough records that you could test it or not, that type of thing. So, you know, ones that I would, you know, records that are considered like cash rejects or vacant lot rejects, I wouldn't recommend that necessarily that you test it. One is the Postal Service software has identified this as, you know, we don't think it's a deliverable. You know, we believe this record is undeliverable as addressed. A vacant lot reject is somebody where the Postal Service is actually indicated, and it ends up on the DPV file, or I take that back, the DSF2 file, and it's indicated that this is a valid address, but nobody lives there. So it's vacant. So I wouldn't necessarily indicate to, you know, that you would necessarily mail to those. Although one of the things that we found out in terms of our testing and looking at it. If a record is identified as a vacant lot and it's also identified as a move, and that move is within the last 6 months, then I would indicate I would go ahead and mail that. If it was, if it's not identified as a move, then my recommendation would be to drop it. But again, these are various categories that are identified through the hygiene process that you would want to look at, and that maybe you're not dropping all of these. And if you're not dropping these and you want to look at it and see, well, maybe I should. I didn't realize that I should be dropping, or I could identify that category. Maybe I should look at that and drop that. Then, talk to us or your service provider about that type of thing.
Marvin, what is the low yield reject category?
In this particular case, the service provider will identify based on modeling techniques, but the majority of the records identified as low yield, I would say 80 to 85% of them are based on address hygiene variations, such as deceased, such as DMA pander, such as vacant lot. Those things feed into the low yield as well. Okay. So back to what I just said, what names and addresses should you omit for your mailing? These are various categories. Not saying you should be dropping them all, but I say that you should be having the conversation on whether you should or not. Okay. Other services by the USPS that you could consider using and sending your house data to, address change service is something you can do. It's a way to get, instead of getting the return mail, you can get the data electronically. Or address element correction is a way of where your address within your file could be missing certain elements like pre-directionals or post-directionals or things of that nature, and it has a way of correcting that and fixing and adding those elements that could be missing from the address. These all have a fee associated with them, but it's fairly nominal. Things to, some of the things that I would recommend, especially now with the COVID and the pandemic, one of the things that we see is there's definitely been an increase in NCOA moves during that period of time. You saw the slide earlier, it said 14% of the country moves every year. We're definitely seeing a spike with that because of COVID. And we've done some testing and we ran an NCOA, and then 3 weeks later, we took the output of that NCOA and ran it again, and we got a 60% increase in the moves, just in that, which kind of goes back to the point of, in all your acquisitions, I'm recommending that you're NCOAing everything for certain suppressions and mailing records, unless you have a way that you're getting all that data done frequently enough to your house files that you've already paid for that you're providing. Ways, again, back to, providing data, getting back data from your acquisition and updating that information within your database. NCOA moves definitely. PCOA, not for the actives, but for the older names. NICSES, flagging records, zip code correction, getting the corrected zip into your database for that address, and then flagging deceased names on the file. It's, a tool that you could utilize to basically use for deselect, but not to remove from your database.
All right, well, that concludes your regular presentation. John, I'm not seeing any other chat questions. I was able to multitask and look.
Nope, we're clean. But the thing is also, please reach out if you have any questions. Everything's available. There's Marvin's contact information is there. So please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Now, I guess we're going to do our fun questions, right, Polly?
Yes, and just real quickly, we're going to be sending you these resources personally to you. So you'll be getting those in a few days. And yes, John, you're leading the two quick trivia questions, and people can respond quickly in the chat function. So John, hopefully you remembered the questions that we discussed yesterday that you are going to ask, or you can make them up on the fly.
Yes, I do remember from yesterday, but if it was the day before, I would have forgotten. So here we go. And being that it's, all the buzz around the Super Bowl and everything else, it's kind of Super Bowl tinged questions. So the winner will be the first one who replies on chat. First question is, Who was the halftime entertainment for the Super Bowl? That's question number one.
Okay, we got, we'll track.
We got, okay, so we'll reach out to the person who wins.
Yeah.
Now the next one, and spelling is not vital on this one because I have no clue how to do it, but what is the name of Tom Brady's wife? Again, spelling doesn't matter, just spit it out there.
Well, they spelled it pretty well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we will reach out to the winners, and Polly, what do they win? I don't even know.
We're going to be sending a $25 gift card to those two winners.
Oh, shoot, I would have responded.
Yeah.
Yeah, we probably should have preferenced that we do have people from MMI that are on this. An employee cannot win the trivia. It has to be somebody else. So
That's
Okay.
right.
if an employee got it correctly first.
That's excellent. So, well, thank you, everyone. We had a really big group. We had about 65 people, and the upcoming trainings will be in your deck that you will receive too. So we have some interesting things coming up, including Marvin will be doing the Merge Purge session on March 23rd. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This has been fantastic. And thank you,
thanks,
Marvin.
everybody. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us.
And certainly any comments, good, bad, or indifferent, please forward.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.